All across America and around the world, this is Veterans Radio. This is Veterans Radio.
Good day. I'm Jim Fausone. I'm the officer of the deck today here on Veterans Radio, and thanks for joining us. We've got some interesting stories for you. We always want to remind you you can find more about Veterans Radio at its Facebook site or at the web, veteransradio.org, where we're on the web 24/7. You can find a lot of our podcasts there as well. We post new ones every Tuesday, so you can get a new story, a new interview, something you didn't know before by going to veteransradio.org. And before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First up, we want to thank Legal Help for Veterans. Legal Help for Veterans fights for veterans' disability rights all across the nation. You can reach them at 800-693-4800 or on the web at legalhelpforveterans.com. We just want to remind you that Veterans Radio podcasts are available on all your favorite streaming platforms, including RSS.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Rees Across America Radio. So wherever you are, you can find us, whether it's on your mobile phone or your computer or your laptop, your tablet. But listen in to Veterans Radio Podcasts. We post something new every week, and you're going to find it informative. We want to welcome to Veterans Radio today a distinguished military and medicine man, Dean Winslow. Colonel, MD, welcome to Veterans Radio.
Right. Well, Jim, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this program. It's a real honor, and thank you for all you do for all of us veterans.
Well, it's really important to sort of keep up to date with things, and that's kind of why we're having this discussion. You're really up to date and have been training in the area of military medicine for years. You are, I should mention, you're an MD. You're a professor at Stanford Medical School. You've got a really long resume, starting out with joining the Louisiana Air National Guard in 1980. And retiring as a colonel. You did time with the Delaware National Guard. You've had 4 tours in Iraq, 2 tours in Afghanistan. All the way up to work at DOD as well as in the field. Interestingly, though, as a 14-year-old kid, you got your pilot's license, and you've logged 3,000 civilian hours and 1,200 military flying hours, including 431 combat hours and 260 combat sorties. So, no question, you're the guy who knows what we should be talking about. But let's start with, how did a nice kid like you get interested in going in the military?
Oh, gosh. Well, honestly, again, I was born in 1953, and my father, like just about everybody, that greatest generation, served during the Second World War. So for me, that was something that, I always wanted to do. And of course, I loved airplanes. So as we were saying before the interview started, there was only one branch of the service that really appealed to me.
Well, you picked the right one. My wife, as I mentioned, was also in the Air Force and the Michigan Air National Guard and served at the Pentagon. So you guys had some similar things. She was on the nursing side, you're on the MD side. Tell folks who might not be familiar, what does a top doc do when doing these 6 overseas assignments? Because you had various roles over time. So give us a thumbnail of that.
Sure. So first of all, being a flight surgeon, it's kind of an old term that goes back probably to the British ship surgeon. But we're trained in aerospace medicine, and our primary job is to care for aircrew, assigned to a combat unit. We also, have some public health responsibilities and that sort of thing. But again, one of the things the Air Force really, really values is that in addition to being trained as an aerospace medicine doctor, that you also have specialty training and experience in a regular specialty. So medicine, surgery, these are all things that are really valuable additional credentials that they really like in flight surgeons. So again, my 6 deployments after 9/11, they all were a little bit different. So 4 of my 6 deployments, I was basically just there as the squadron flight surgeon, supporting the troops, flying occasional air evac missions. Also, by the way, occasionally just helping out, as a regular crew member. Because of my own interest and background in aviation, they always seemed to like, having the doc fly with them.
Who knows a little bit about aeronautics, right? Exactly.
Yeah. And then the 2 of my deployments to Iraq. One was in 2006, so before the surge, when the insurgency was really, I think, at its peak. I was the deputy commander and one of the 2 emergency room doctors at our Air Force Combat Hospital in Baghdad. And then in 2008, I was asked to come back and command the 447th EMEDS, again, our combat hospital at Baghdad International Airport. So again, those roles basically are, very different than being, just a flight surgeon caring for the air crew. So here we're basically running a combat hospital and seeing both medical and surgical cases, involved in the war.
And one of the things that I think every veteran's kind of aware of, there's sort of a signature or a different set of injuries in every war because the methods of war, the technology of war changes. We're not talking mustard gas in World War I anymore. And you saw that progression occurring during your career where IEDs and blasts, concussion blast, TBI became sort of this signature. I suspect that was consistent with your experience.
Absolutely, Jim. Of course, we still did see, some serious injuries and fatalities from small arms fire. But again, the much more effective, like Kevlar helmets that we had, and the IBA or body armor that we wore, with ceramic strike plates in front and back, and even plates protecting our sides, helped prevent a lot of the fatalities from small arms fire that we saw certainly in the Vietnam and the Korean wars. So again, as you rightly said, that sort of the signature injuries that produced probably about 65%, if not more, of our casualties in both Iraq and Afghanistan were related to improvised explosive devices. And these, range from, fairly simple devices, often buried, underneath, small amounts of dirt, to these very sophisticated, what we called EFPs, or explosively formed penetrator or shape charged IEDs that we saw, particularly after 2005 in Iraq. And again, not getting involved with some of the current politics, but again, these actually horrible EFP weapons were supplied by the Iranians to the Shia splinter groups in Iraq. And these injuries were just absolutely devastating because of just the strength of the explosion and the fact that it was all directed one direction. So these devices, which were often coupled with passive IR detectors to actually detect the heat of a passing vehicle, they were so powerful that they could, even if they hit it right, penetrate the armor of an Abrams tank. So certainly a more lightly armored vehicle like a Stryker vehicle or a up-armored Humvee was no match for these horrible EFPs. And I still have bad dreams about, some of the particularly body bags that I unzipped of soldiers killed by these terrible devices.
And as you say, it's sort of, man's ingenuity and cruelty leads to changes in warfare. And we've got a couple of wars going on now in the world, in Ukraine and in Iran. And we're seeing both Russia and Ukraine forces use a different type of unmanned vehicle or drone. And I hadn't really thought about it. And that's why I wanted you on to talk about how that's changed the injuries that soldiers may face. And while military medicine was praised for how quickly it could get to folks in Afghanistan and save lives, it's different now. The damage is different. Talk a little bit about today's current drone warfare and the resulting injuries.
No, absolutely. Be happy to talk about that. Just again, a little bit of background though is that we certainly did also see what we call indirect fire, in Iraq and Afghanistan, and by that, we usually mean mortars, but you had to be pretty close to a base to basically lob a mortar in. But we also were attacked occasionally with 81 millimeter rockets in Iraq, and then these large Chinese made Type 63 107 millimeter rockets in Afghanistan. That was, again, the main indirect fire weapon that the Taliban used against us in Afghanistan. So, some of the things that we did that were very effective in both Iraq and Afghanistan is that we had our buildings always surrounded just about by what we call T-walls, these large, many cases 15 or so feet high cement barriers. So again, the way that the rockets were fused would be they would basically detonate on impact. So the T-walls provided great protection, unless he was unlucky enough that a rocket actually came through, the roof of a bee hut, which actually did happen during my last Afghanistan deployment. But otherwise, the T-walls provided good protection against, rockets and mortars. The problem with these drones that are being deployed both in the war in Ukraine as well as in Iran are the fact that these are suicide drones that are able to come at fairly low speed and hover stationary over a target, either personnel or an armored vehicle, and then very precisely, basically hover over that area and then detonate above the target. One of the big differences is that, for example, even these large 107 millimeter rockets that our bases would be attacked with in Afghanistan had about, I think, a 2.9 pound warhead, whereas these Shahed 136 drones that are being employed in Iran, they actually have anywhere from a 60 to 110 pound warhead. So it's, an order of magnitude larger. So, again, when you just think about the strength of the blast injuries, that it's pretty devastating. And
And
again,
the technology is more focused. As you
yeah.
said, you hover because there's all kinds of sensors and visuals.
Hmm.
You might hover over a target and wait for the infantry to move or the personnel carrier to start letting
Yeah.
guys out. I mean, we've seen it in the Ukraine videos what they're
Mhm.
doing to the Russians. So it's not only a bigger explosive device, it's a little more honed, again, resulting in slightly different, maybe more than slightly, different injuries.
Absolutely. And again, as I tried to point out, that the T-walls are completely ineffective because the blast is coming from really directly above. And again, there is no protection.
When you go and do a little research on this, I'm really, again, hadn't thought about this, but these drone bomb injuries apparently have more severe traumatic amputations, shrapnel wounds, burns, TBIs, blast waves, and this has been written up in the Lancet and other
Yeah.
medical journals over some period of time. But how does that reshape or change the way you think about delivering the sort of military medicine the U.S.
Mhm.
forces expect to have and had in the past?
Yeah. So there's a couple of aspects to it. So again, just the fact that the charge is an order of magnitude larger than with a 107, you do see much more, as a general rule, severe injuries. Although again, if you happen to have stepped on an IED, in a dismounted patrol, a lot of soldiers did lose their legs. But again, you're also going to see, I think, more upper body injuries are what they're seeing, as well. But just the severity of these blast injuries is just so much greater because again, you're dealing with, essentially a many magnitude larger warhead that's being detonated directly above personnel. The other thing which I'd like to address real briefly, kind of from a tactical standpoint, is that, in Iraq and Afghanistan, we basically had complete air superiority, once we went in on the ground. And so there's this concept in trauma management called the golden hour, where you try to basically stabilize somebody, but get them to an operating room within an hour, so you can have more definitive, care for these traumatic injuries by surgeons. Whereas, we really certainly do not have that type of air superiority, in Iran. And that's one thing that just keeps me up at night worrying about that if we do go in on the ground. So again, I think it'll be very difficult, for example, to get troops out within that are wounded within that golden hour. And it even puts more pressure on basically the soldiers, airmen, Marines, buddies to provide what we call tactical combat casualty care to keep people alive for many more hours. But again, though, that's not a substitute though for having definitive surgical care, which we were able to do usually within that golden hour in both Iraq and Afghanistan, so we could get a medevac helicopter in and get that person to a combat support hospital within that hour of time.
We've seen again in Ukraine and Iran these drones come in swarms.
Yes.
I think Israel's and a lot of the Middle East countries are experiencing this, trying to shoot down swarms of these kind of drones. How do you ramp up the medical training or the medical availability to give that tactical combat casualty care in so many places at once? Do you have to expand who's able to provide it?
Well, so again, the TCCC program, which is a very just absolutely amazing program that's continued to evolve, is primarily directed at essentially soldiers, Marines giving care to each other. So they actually are trained how to insert temporary airways, how to use what we call our CAT or combat application tourniquets, to control hemorrhage. So that's basically not at the level of professionals. This is basically the training that we provide, to infantrymen and to, maintainers and other, airmen and soldiers that are deployed, basically to keep people alive. But again, there's only so much that you can do, if you have to extend that care much beyond that golden hour. And so that's one of the things that I think many of us are concerned about is the fact that we're not going to be able to get people into an operating room in most cases within that hour.
So I think I read something that you've either been reviewing or critiquing or teaching some of this TCCC training.
Mm-hmm.
So does the Department of Defense or War, depending on what you want to call it, does it get it? Does it get that medical care has to evolve?
I think it does, and again, but this really is a whole new world, and certainly, that since the war started in Ukraine, this is really, I think, the first, major combat action, where we have, had to deal with these drones, and also, as I mentioned, that the fact that we likely will not have the type of air superiority that we benefited from in both Iraq and Afghanistan. In terms of though, the care that the surgeons provide, that is something that also I've been concerned about over the years. So if you look at actually the active duty medical installations that we have, that they're pretty much most of them are community hospitals, other than some of the real big ones, like Walter Reed in Washington D.C. and Brooke Army Medical Center and the Joint Base San Antonio facilities, and also I guess, well, of course, the Naval Hospital in San Diego is a very much a very sophisticated facility. But most of the hospitals on active duty military installations are really small community hospitals, where they do primary care, pediatrics, some OBGYN, and they'll do some surgery, but it's not the complicated surgery that you would have at a trauma center or even at a university medical center or a large VA hospital. And surgery is like a lot of things that it requires practice and currency. And so that's one of the things that actually I raised as an issue at my confirmation hearing to be Assistant Secretary of Defense back in 2017. And I think we do need to develop more public-private partnerships and make it easier for surgeons in the military who are on these small active duty military hospitals to actually work in trauma centers so they get, a little bit more recency of experience before they deploy.
Over the last few years, there's been concern about the military making its enlistment goals, right? Having enough force strength across all of the services. I think you're suggesting, or maybe I can get you to say this directly, that you have a concern that we're not enlisting or embracing ways to get the type of surgeons and medical doctors into the military that we need, or into the Guard and Reserve where they might have kind of this dual role. Can you talk a little bit about the concern about having enough true surgeons in place should we ever need them?
Yeah. Well, we really do. We're doing a good job. I mean, I think recruiting surgeons as well as other, medical specialists, to go into the military. And again, I just have great respect for people that, want to go in and devote anywhere from 4 to more than 20 years of their professional lives in the military. I think it's a noble cause. But again, the point I was trying to make, though, is the fact that on the active duty side, that most of the hospitals that we have in the military, since we've closed many of the large flagship hospitals that we had in the 1970s, most of the hospitals that we have now are fairly small community hospitals. And so, for example, a surgeon might only do a half a dozen surgical cases a week in one of these hospitals, and they might be like laparoscopic hernia repairs or things like that. They're not dealing with major trauma like you would in at Baltimore Shock Trauma Center or University of Cincinnati, where, by the way, we do have partnerships, but not the capacities to train the potentially hundreds of military surgeons that we would need in a conflict. And that also, again, as you kind of alluded to, one place where I was really proud of the job that Guard and Reserve did, during our long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, because so many of us were deployed, that we did bring more of that recency of experience, to these forward hospitals.
Well, I want to end here a little bit with giving a plug for if there's a medical professional out there, a doctor thinking about maybe military service. You've had a really fascinating career. We could have talked about you being the lead physician for the U.S. Antarctica program, for the National Science Foundation, your work on COVID issues, HIV and infectious diseases, all of your fellows, you're a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians, the American Academy of Pediatrics, Infectious Disease Society of America. But a lot of this is all kind of based on you've had this incredible experience through your military career that led in different directions. Give the plug for guys and gals who might be thinking about it is, should I spend some time in the service with my medical degree?
Yeah, well, I would, of course, say in a heartbeat. In fact, if I were 20 years younger, I would do it again. And because again, it's this wonderful mission. There's this sense of purpose. There's the camaraderie, and the fact that serving your country is one of the noblest things that you can do. So I definitely would encourage people to spend time in the military. But as I said, though, we also need to develop more robust civil military medical relationships so people can really maintain their currency, particularly in these the surgical fields.
Do you think the DoD today gets that? Are they working on that? Would you like what are you looking for them to do?
Yeah. So again, I think there is certainly an awareness of this, in the military healthcare system. But again, the problem is a little bit of, how do you actually implement it? And again, you have to have, say, someone on duty, at the base hospital and things. And how do you give them the time off that they can actually go spend, a day or so a week on average, at a large civilian trauma center. So I think there's some logistics that have to be worked out. But I know, for a fact that, supporting the military, is something that we want to do, from academia. But again, there needs to be some, sort of practical steps made to make it easier than it is now to do.
We're talking to Dr. Dean Winslow, who's a retired colonel from the Air Force, who's got a long pedigree. He's also a professor at Stanford, on the Stanford faculty. And I wanted to thank you for making us think a little bit about how drone warfare today is changing some of the needs of military medicine and some of the things that maybe need to be worked on into the future. Thanks for your time today, Doctor.
No, thank you, Jim, and thanks again for the good work you're doing with your podcast.
And I want to thank everybody for listening to Veterans Radio today. I am Jim Fausone. It's been a pleasure to be your host. I'm a veterans disability lawyer at Legal Help for Veterans, and you can reach us at 800-693-4800 or legalhelpforveterans.com on the web. You can follow Veterans Radio on Facebook and listen to its podcasts and internet radio shows
by visiting us at veteransradio.org. That's veteransradio.org. We again want to thank our national sponsors, the National Veterans Business Development Council, nvbdc.org, Legal Help for Veterans, a veterans disability law firm with a national practice before the VA, can help you on your claims and your appeals. It can be reached at legalhelpforveterans.com or 1-800-693-4800. We also want to thank our local sponsors. This would include the Charles S. Kettles chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America, that's chapter 310, VFW Graf O'Hara Post 423, the American Legion Irwin Preston Post 46 in Ann Arbor as well, the VA Ann Arbor Healthcare System, and certainly the National Vietnam Veterans of America Association. You can be a sponsor by going to veteransradio.org, clicking on the About Us and our sponsors, and help us out. Keep this program alive for the 21 and 22 years. Keep us going for another 20. Thank you.